So I'm going to start with actually a poem which I wrote yesterday morning, and then I'm going to finish with another one which I also wrote yesterday morning. And you'll understand it because if you were here. It's called Angles of Approach. Speaking words, swooping swallows, cut through as life in motion, chirping, not talking. Being joy, flying freely through the air, perching above, looking down on chattering minds, longing to be steeped in deep silence. That's poem, the beginning poem. So what I'm going to talk about this morning is the Galileo Commission report. And I can tell you that the package that was meant to be here now got to Torino on the 28th of June. So we don't know where it is, but it's coming. And there are leaflets for everybody. There are 50 summary booklets for the sort of really keen people who really want to know about it. And then online, you will find the Galileo Commission report. This is the full version here. There's a summary version. You can order it, you can download everything free, but you can also order it, if you want a hard copy, you can order that, either the summary version or the full version, which you can get on lulu.com. So that's the report. Is there any way of making the screen slightly wider, this screen here, because it sort of cuts off on the end? I'm missing the T of post-materialist. I have it up here. Okay, well that means I probably have to do some reading from up here. So we're talking about getting beyond a materialist worldview. And this is the materialist worldview that dominates science, neuroscience, philosophy, psychology, academia generally. And this is the respectable worldview. Most of us here are not respectable. We have a different worldview. We're on the edge, and we're Gnostics and heretics. And this is where Gnostics, heretics, non-dual people come together to hang out and really create this wonderful community. So here is something that you may know from Max Planck. It was an interview with The Observer, 1931. I regard consciousness as fundamental. Matter is derivative from consciousness. We cannot get behind consciousness because we have to use consciousness for everything. Everything we talk about, everything we regard as existing, postulates consciousness. There is no matter as such. It exists only by virtue of a force bringing the particle to vibration and holding it together in a minute solar system. We must assume behind this force the existence of a conscious and intelligent mind. The mind is the matrix of all matter. This is an incredible quotation from Nobel Prize-winning inventor of quantum theory. And this is what we use for our Beyond the Brain conference every year, coming up, beyondthebrain.org, 2nd and 3rd of November in London. Now, why is it called the Galileo Commission? Because in Galileo's time, the professors of philosophy and the cardinals, some of the cardinals, refused to look through the telescope. Why did they refuse to look through the telescope? They thought they knew in advance that there was nothing to be seen. And so what we are inviting scientists to do is to expand their view and look through the telescope at all the evidence there is, which undermines the assumption that the mind is produced by the brain. And so that's a sentence. That's in one sentence is my talk, but I'm going to carry on. So there's Galileo looking through his telescope. And he wrote in a letter to Kepler, here at Padua is the principal professor of philosophy, whom I've repeatedly and urgently requested to look at the moon and the planets through my glass, which he pertinaciously refuses to do. And this is exactly the position with the skeptics movement in science. They pertinaciously refuse to look at anything. They assume they've got all the right answers, and if they haven't got the answers now, they soon will. and this is what's called promissory materialism. And the question here is authority. So it's the authority of materialistic science that is at stake. It was the authority of Aristotle and the authority of the church that was at stake in Galileo's time. Now here is something I find very helpful, which are the 3 I's of Bonaventure, contemporary, slightly younger than Francis of Assisi. And he said there was the eye of contemplation, which is the intellect that enables gnosis, the nous in Greek, and this is the non-dual eye, if you like. Then the eye of reason, mathematics, logic, and this is called dianoia, and the eye of sense. And what you'll see is that the church, in terms of and philosophy, psychology, and science, they've downgraded inner knowing and gnosis, and assumed that everything can be explained through senses and reason. So they just got to cut off. It's what I call a metaphysical amputation. They've cut off the whole of our higher faculties, which enable us to know things intuitively. And the reason I've got Peter Kingsley in here is that he's just written an enormous book called Catafalque, Jung and the End of Humanity. If you're a voracious reader and you love Jung, you've got to read this book. Volume 1, 450 pages. Volume 2, 450 pages of notes. And so it's the only book I've read where I've had to have 2 books open at once. So I get to note 52, and it goes on for a page. And there might be 20 references in there for that one note. It's a staggering piece of work. So look up peterkingsley.com, catafalque.com, and you will be amazed when you read this and how important it is that we've forgotten that the origins of Western philosophy were in mysticism. They were in initiation. They were in gnosis. Empedocles, Parmenides, all these pre-Socratic philosophers, they were all initiates. So modern science is looking through the lenses of reason and sense. It's also left hemisphere dominated, and some of you will know the work of Ian McGilchrist, my friend Ian McGilchrist, The Master and His Emissary, worth reading if you haven't read it. He's struggling to finish his next book at the moment. And that one of the key points is that the observer, the knower, the subject consciousness is excluded from the picture. And so this was left us with metaphysical amputation, suppression of gnosis for pistis, which is faith in the church, or belief, and now unbelief. And there's a whole huge project going on at Kent University at the moment on unbelief, and you may have read something about this in the newspapers recently. So here is Schroedinger. It's a very important book with a foreword by Sir Roger Penrose many years ago. I cut out my mind when I construct the real world around me. Notice real world. And I'm not aware of this cutting out. This is the key point. And then I'm very astonished that the scientific picture of the real world around me is very deficient. It gives us a lot of factual information, puts all of our experience in magnificently consistent order, but is ghastly silent about all and sundry that is really near to our heart and that really matters to us. It cannot tell us a word about red and blue, bitter and sweet, physical pain and physical delight. It knows nothing of beautiful, ugly, good or bad, God and eternity. And this is a fundamental point, but because you cut out the qualia, the subjectivity, the consciousness, and then you try and fit it back in again. I mean, why not leave it in there in the first place, rather than having this problem of cutting it out and having to find it again? So here is what we're talking about here, is the relationship between metaphysics or philosophy and science. And I've just highlighted a few of the really important people. I can't go into this in any detail, but you can follow this up yourselves. Alfred Russel Wallace, who was the co-founder of natural selection with Darwin. He was a spiritualist. And so that made him very unpopular with the rest of his scientific colleagues who thought he was quite loopy in this respect, and that still happens these days. You have to be sound, you see. If you're going to be in science and philosophy and academic, you have to be sound. And if you're not sound, i.e. you are interested in real life and interesting experiences, then you can't really stick your head above the parapet as an academic. F.C.S. Schiller, someone you've probably never heard of, Don in Oxford, Riddles of the Sphinx, 1891, where he said that consciousness may be transmitted or filtered by the brain rather than produced by the brain. And that's exactly what William James says in his Ingersoll lecture on immortality. You can get this online. It's about 8,000 words. I highly recommend it. So just Google Ingersoll lecture on immortality, William James, and it'll come up. And it's a seminal piece of work, but it draws on Schiller. Then Burt, The Metaphysical Foundations of Modern Science, 1925. I bought this book in Plymouth in 1976 when I was 24, and it just completely opened my mind to this whole area of philosophy and science. And then we have R.G. Collingwood and Whitehead, and then more recently, Willis Harman, Noetic Sciences, New Metaphysical Foundations of Modern Science. So these are all the background to the Galileo report. And one of our advisors, we have 90 advisors behind this report from 30 universities. And if you look at the back here, you'll find all the leading thinkers, almost all the leading thinkers in the field: Stan Grof, Charlie Tart, Rick Tarnas, Dean Radin, you name them, they're behind this initiative. And so this is Richard Tarnas on world views. And the important thing to realize is that we all have one. We all have a worldview, and our assumptions are not necessarily articulated and explicit. So you can see that this is something that our worldview, our metaphors, our myths, so the mechanistic metaphor, interpreting the world as a machine, this is a metaphor, a constellate outer reality, so worldviews create worlds. I haven't read the whole of this. You can. I'm very happy for my PowerPoint to be shared with everybody, and then you can, think about these things at your leisure. Then Collingwood is probably somebody that you've never heard of. My friend Ian McGilchrist was a scholar at Winchester College. He read Collingwood's essay on metaphysics when he was 16. Unbelievable. I wouldn't have been understood the first sentence when I was 16. So this is a really important point. The answer to any question presupposes whatever the question presupposes, and because all science begins with a question, for the question is logically prior to its own answer, all science begins with a presupposition. That's what I want you to remember. All science begins with a presupposition. This may be a bit technical, but I hope you can get your head around it. Heisenberg, what we observe is not nature itself, but nature exposed to our method of questioning. Everything that looks like to a nail, if you've got a hammer, everything looks like a nail. Hence the inescapable presuppositions. Most working scientists do not realize they've got any assumptions or philosophy at all. Richard Feynman, philosophy of science is to scientists what ornithology is to birds, i.e. they're not terribly interested, but they should be. And here's the hard problem of consciousness. I met David Chalmers in Interlaken last week, and his question is, how does the brain generate consciousness? So what kind of answer are you looking for? How does the brain generate consciousness? Which assumes that the brain generates consciousness. This is exactly what is at issue here. So the question contains with it the presupposition that the brain does indeed generate consciousness. This is what we're criticizing in the Galileo report. And this is assumed by neuroscience, and Jack said this yesterday, by neuroscience, psychology, philosophy. It's universal and unquestioned. 99%, I would say. So the Galileo Commission challenges this, and William James, as I mentioned before, he says, we know that my brain and mind are connected, but how? Is it produced? Is consciousness produced by the brain, or is it somehow filtered and transmitted? And if you want some technical stuff on this, have a look at Irreducible Mind and Beyond Physicalism or Spiritual Science. So Irreducible Mind, Beyond Physicalism, University of Virginia Press, Rowman and Littlefield, it comes out of University of Virginia. And then Spiritual Science by Steve Taylor, who is speaking it on Beyond the Brain this year. Mary Midgley was a philosopher whose last book came out when she was 99. Wow. I knew her quite well, and she was a feisty woman standing up to Richard Dawkins and Peter Atkins. And Dawkins apparently wouldn't even be in the same room as her. because her criticisms were so penetrating. And so she talks about, that's her last book, What is Philosophy For? And if you're interested in philosophy, you need to get that, and also her book, Are You an Illusion? And the answer is no, you aren't an illusion. But maybe your ego is, but that's another lecture. So Krauss, this is Lawrence Krauss, physicist, science provides the ultimate account of reality, the ultimate metaphysics. It is based on physical evidence. But Midgley says this is scientific materialism. This is scientism. It is an ideology, a presupposition, philosophy rather than science, and it cannot apply to reality as a whole. And that's the important point. In reality, not all questions are physical questions, or can be usefully fitted to physical answers. I mean, it's fairly obvious, isn't it? But it's not obvious to those who are looking through this rather narrow lens. And then ironically, and this is what Collingwood says, to attack metaphysics, which the logical positivists did in the 1930s, is to attack the foundations of science in terms of logic and reasoning that derive from philosophy. You can't do science without using logic and reasoning. So here we are, back to the telescope. And so what we're saying is that the assumption the brain produces consciousness, it underpins all conventional research, but it does involve refusing to look through the telescope, which indicates evidence that indicates that consciousness might in fact be fundamental, and that there are non-local aspects beyond the brain. And so what we review in this report is the evidence for ESP, telepathy, clairvoyance, psychokinesis, and particularly veridical out-of-body experiences in the near-death state, and also children who remember previous lives, which is a huge research project from the University of Virginia from Ian Stevenson. And if you go to Wikipedia, you will find that Wikipedia, all the parapsychology and complementary medicine entries are controlled by the guerrilla skeptics. And this is a form of intellectual terrorism. Because what they do is if you go in and change something, so like all scientists think that Rupert Sheldrake talks nonsense every time he opens his mouth, and he more or less says that, and he's a great friend of mine, Rupert. If you say some scientists, which a friend of mine did, they try to get you banned from Wikipedia. So this is something everybody should know, that there is a distortion in Wikipedia controlled by the guerrilla skeptics. And it's a disgrace, and it should be publicly known. There should be a newspaper article, a feature on this, blowing the cover and blowing it to smithereens. But the trouble is that most of the media are exactly the same skeptics, materialists, as the scientists and philosophers. And that's the reason I couldn't get my book on Prince of Wales published in England, because all the publishers wanted a skeptical view, and a book that criticized him rather than reinforced his perennial philosophy. So here's Wallace, and this is in a very good essay, which demolishes Hume's essay on miracles. My first great lesson into these obscure fields is never to accept the disbelief of great men or their accusations of imposture or imbecility as of any weight when opposed to the repeated observation of facts by other men, admittedly sane and honest. I assert, and this is the important sentence, that whenever the scientific men of any age have denied the facts of investigators on a priori grounds, they have always been wrong. Written in 1871, just as true in 2019. And this is what Jeffrey Kripal was saying last week in Interlaken. There are no impossible facts. If something happens, it's possible, not impossible. And so we really have to say the emperor has no clothes when it comes to people denying these sorts of experiences. And many even scientists themselves, they have these unusual, impossible experiences. But if they sit around a table at dinner, they'll say, yes, I had this and the next thing, but I'm certainly not going to mention it to my colleagues. And everybody's actually thinking the same. And so there's this ridiculous situation when actually if everybody came out and said, yes, these are interesting and I had these kind of experiences, what a relief. Not only will we talk about them, we can investigate them and research them. And so Wallace says, to put the matter in simple form, the asserted fact is either possible or not possible. If possible, such evidence as we have been considering would prove it. If not possible, such evidence could not exist. You know, this is just knocks the whole thing out. You cannot have an impossible fact. Larry LeShan, impossible events do not occur. Therefore, if a scientist is faced with the fact he has an impossible event, our daily fare as psychical researchers, the paradox must be resolved, and the danger is that we accept our definition of reality as a fact when it's in fact a theory. Hence, if an event is a major violation of our theory about reality, a major revision of that theory is necessary. We need a major revision of the scientific worldview. Jeffrey Kripal said exactly the same. He said, if the problem is not with the experiences, it's with a deficient worldview. A worldview that says this is impossible. If it's impossible, you have to change your worldview. And this is H.H. Price, Wykeham Professor of Logic before A.J. Ayer in Oxford. We must conclude there's no room for telepathy in a materialistic universe. Shouldn't happen if the materialist theory were true, but it does happen, so there must be something seriously wrong with the materialist theory, however numerous and imposing the normal facts which support it, sorry, it should be support it, not support ed, support it may be, and this is true now as it was in 1949, 70 years ago. And so this is the evidence that I've mentioned towards a post-materialist science, evidence-based spirituality, veridical OBE reports in NDEs. And the NDE is, in my view, a form of initiation, gnosis and initiation, but that's a separate lecture. Huge database of parapsychology and anomalous cognition, children remember previous lives, survival research. And so this eye of contemplation provides valid access to these deeper structures and levels of reality. And that's the key thing, that we can compare notes as well in these deeper areas. And so we need an expanded ontology, which is being, philosophy, metaphysics, extended epistemology, which is the theory of knowledge, and extended methodologies like in contemplative neuroscience. Now, here's why this is important. The very definition of the human being is at stake. We're going towards what you might call technotopic transhumanism, but we have to keep this human-centered posthumanism at the center of our concern. Because how much money is going into AI? Trillions. How much money is going to transform ourselves? Almost nothing. It's staggering. And yet all the problems that we have in the world are created by our mentalities, our ideas, our worldviews, our ethical views, our views of ourselves. So if we don't change those, then nothing's going to change on the outside. And so this is why this is so important. And this is a book called The Restitution of Man by Michael Aeschliman. And this is an important point, because what he says is that we have to distinguish between mechanisms and organisms, between persons and things. And if you abolish that distinction, then you get a dehumanized view of the human being, and you get rid of sapientia, which is the wisdom case, and you say that scientia, which is knowledge, is enough. It isn't. So we need a multidimensional view of the human being, one which includes meaning and values. And this is crucial for our future of mental health, and especially among young people. And I work with young people, thousands of young people a year, helping to inspire them with a sense of purpose. And if you're interested in this, this is www.inspiringpurpose.org.uk. So websites, GalileoCommission.org, do go and visit it, sign up as a friend, or a professional affiliate. If you've got an academic background, you can sign up as a professional affiliate and support us. Scientific Medical Network, scimednet.org. This is my journal that I edit 3 times a year. And then these are other organizations: Academy for the Advancement of Post-Materialist Science, opensciences.org, Noetic Sciences, Parapsychological, spr.ac.uk. And as a PS, if any of you are interested in Catharism and Cathars, then we do retreats on this in the Cathar area. And I think that brings me just in time, I hope, to my poem, my last poem. Is that okay? 1 minute. Right, that's exactly how much I need. So this is really for you, Shakti. And it's called Still Moving. Still moving, suspended in stillness, the mind calm, rippling only gently, a cloud of thought passing slowly through, mirrored only lightly, a wisp of smoke dispersing, dissipating finely in the clear air, the lightest brushstroke, a white feather alighting, floating, flowing gently away.